There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Hey, everybody out there listening, welcome again to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms. I've got Nephi Cole mirror imaging me right now. I'm leaning back in a chair. He's leaning back across from me in his chair, hands on his head. I'm
going to keep doing it.
Yeah, now that I've brought it up.
Till it gets really disturbing.
It's going to get awkward and uncomfortable.
Yeah, luckily, there's several feet of desk between us.
Yep, there is.
Yeah, and we each have a laptop open too, which makes it extra creepy.
It does, but I don't have a Monster Energy drink like you do. Yeah,
I do.
Per the usual for you, right?
It's tradition.
Mike is unable to join us today. So we, as a result of that, this has the ability to, really
go off the rails,
devolve into something really primal.
A fist fight.
Yeah, right. He's not here to mitigate and keep us sane and fact check us and, all that kind of stuff. So, because of that, we might have a little bit of fun today.
Yeah, Mike is a real fun crusher.
We'll see if he's listening to this episode to hear all of these bashing remarks.
We'll hear about it later.
I'm sure.
Along with all of our inaccuracies, and
I'm sure we'll have to run some sort of follow-up episode.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the complex.
It's too bad that he's not going to be here today, too, right? Because we decided to take on an uncontroversial topic today, something that nobody ever talks about and that we've never worked on.
The census.
Yeah, we're going to do more about the census. No, more about the census.
Well, please don't push stop.
Yeah, in a manner of speaking, we're talking about the census, right? But
please don't hang up.
But we're talking about populations of animals, particular animals, right? So we're census in a regard.
Yes.
No, today it's all about wolves.
Canis lupus.
Canis lupus, right? All about wolves.
So scary when you say it that way, but I love it.
Right.
Wolves.
I want you to start this.
Have you ever... Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say I want you to start this off because you have a particular phrase you use a lot that I think is very appropriate for
challenging. Wolves are challenging.
Today's complicated. It's a challenging issue.
Have you ever run into them in the wild?
I have. Have you?
I have as well, yes, multiple times.
Yeah, same here.
You know what was my biggest regret?
Not having a license in your pocket at the time.
Out of range.
So I've seen them in Yellowstone.
Out of range from me?
That's saying something, right? So you haven't been up close and personal. I was so close to one once that I got video footage with my cell phone of it and had to back up.
Because he was on your arm?
Because he was standing next to the road in Yellowstone.
Yeah, the secret is to hold your arm. You let him grab your arm. If you sacrifice your arm, then you can punch.
Yeah, or get a good photograph.
Yeah.
No, and last year we had him howling all around our camp on a backpacking trip up in the upper northern wind rivers of Wyoming, and definitely have been around them. They're elusive, haven't seen a lot.
Yes.
Hear them at night frequently.
And the joke, which I talked about earlier, because I was being facetious, was in reality, I was up elk hunting in what was the predator zone at the time in Wyoming, and they were illegal at the time. But I saw a pack up there and are
still legal. You might mention we still have a predator zone.
Yeah, from a long ways away through a set of binoculars, but it was very interesting.
I'm going to call out somebody, our current, when you're talking about how far away they were.
Mm-hmm.
I know somebody that had an opportunity to take a gray wolf and pulled the trigger and missed.
Who was that?
He happens to be a very high-ranking official in the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, whom maybe I won't name names on it to protect the
it's not innocent,
it's not
the guilty.
The guilty for for the failure there.
Get a new rifle.
Yeah,
and a better optic.
Neither one of us would have missed that shot.
No.
Would you hunt wolves?
Yes. So would. Yeah. Just like any other species that I would hunt, because if the population numbers need to be controlled, and if the biologists who run these agencies have determined that there's a population and a surplus and it makes sense to control the population to a certain level, if I had the opportunity to go and hunt that species, I would.
Yeah. I don't know if I would. And obviously I support wolf hunting. I have no objection to it at all. But I've always been a eat what you kill guy.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? I know that about you.
Yeah,
and a lot of people feel that way, and a lot of people say that thing about cougars and something. But
I'd eat a cougar.
But here's the thing: I would back people up
I've
from.
eaten cougar. Cougar's good.
Yeah, I heard it's like pork.
Pork, very much like pork. Yeah.
But the argument, and I don't want to devolve too far into this, but people need to remember there are a lot of us that there's this thing about like, oh yeah, there's this, you pick this reason that's okay for you. But remember, if you step back from the entire picture and realize that while hunting is a management tool, and that's my contention, is like we devolve into this thing where somebody's like, oh, I'm a sport hunter, I'm this hunter, I'm that. No. Remember, at the back up at the end of the day, what you are is part of a tool of the game and fish and biologists in a given state use to manage game numbers at sustainable levels and in a balanced manner. And people need to remember that when they get all judgy about why one guy hunts or another guy hunts. Those tags that are out there for a reason, and they're because we're trying to balance the entire system.
Yeah, and I hope you don't think I'm being judgy. Like, I don't care.
No, some people are though.
I don't care. You know, we have a season set up. We've made a policy decision that you don't have to consume the meat. That there are other policy reasons and biological reasons to control the population, to manage the population within a certain geographic area, and to keep numbers at a certain level. And I support the approach we've taken. I just come from a camp where I need to eat what I kill. And so if I'm going to go wolf hunting, I got to figure out if there's a good way to cook those things. So if anybody's got an idea, anybody out there has thought, I've got a good way to cook up canine, or a little Canis lupus soup, whatever it happens to be, let me know. I might be interested at that point. Once I could.
You're disturbing.
What? About potentially eating wolves?
No, I'm just kidding.
No.
If it were like, I don't judge on those things either. Like, you like to eat wolf, you don't like to eat wolf, like, fine by me.
Yeah.
To each his own. And as long as those things that they're legal, that they're done in an ethical manner, by that I mean, I don't want, you don't want it to become a clown show.
Yeah, don't go chasing them down in snowmobiles, wear them out until they pass out and die.
Because please, that's bad for us, our hunting in general.
It's bad for the hunting community when you see stories like that.
Because when people see that, like, they don't understand the whole management shtick. They don't, when we're trying to talk about balance, like that doesn't make any sense to a cat lady from New York. She does not even care.
And we got to remember, we're up against it, right? We're up against it. The vast majority of the population doesn't hunt. And especially when it comes to predators, there are very few people out there that understand, they struggle with the idea of hunting predators. So if we do things that put us as a hunting community in a bad light amongst a larger population, it actually puts the whole heritage at risk, because the people that are legislating it aren't always hunters. They might support hunting, and they're okay providing that opportunity. They might support it, but if you give them a reason to not support it,
and I'm going to come around full circle again to that balance. I mean, you said it's like some people have an issue with hunting predators. Well, guess what? When predator numbers get too large for the prey base to support, or what, you start to have issues. You have to hunt the predator populations too. You have to be willing to manage everything in the system. And this idea that we're going to step back and let Mother Nature take its course, well, guess what? Mother Nature doesn't care, and Mother Nature is cruel. And Mother Nature is just great with cycles where everything gets eaten down to where, half of what exists on the landscape is starving to death and the other half is gone, because Mother Nature doesn't think.
Well, but
Mother Nature just happens.
Now let's also remember one of the reasons why we have this active management, and we talk about needing active management of all these species, is one, because we got humans on the landscape and we've fragmented habitats, but the other piece is we have humans on the landscape, and it's an economic and a food resource for us too. And so we want to see that active management is to maintain healthy, viable populations that continue to support our interests in them as well. If you take us out of the mix and say we're not going to have any hunting, then sure, nature's going to figure it out. It has for millennia.
Something will happen. You just don't know what. And so the choice to do nothing is still a choice. It's just that it's not an informed choice. It's not a logical choice. It's just a choice to do nothing.
It's not at this point, right? All this wildlife thrived for millennia without us here, but we've made it
arguable.
don't know. There's pretty good scientific record that.
Oh no, I'm just saying is like when people say that, I mean, what they're like, all these wildlife, like again, this wasn't Bambi, where everything was running around like in balance, and
it was cyclical.
That's right.
Of course, it was cyclical.
Yes,
but the question
certain
is how
stuff thrived, and certain stuff didn't.
But what we've made a decision on as humans is so there's still cycles. Right. What we're trying to do is cut off the bottom of that cycle and cut off the top of that cycle and make that sine wave a lot tighter.
We have decided that we're going to care about what it looks like. We're not just going to put ourselves in blinders, live in a concrete box, and just, hey, let's see what happens. We have decided that there's an outcome that's preferable, one outcome versus another. Point. And so we're going to drive towards a preferred outcome.
That's my point. Yeah. So what we're driving for is we're taking off the tops and the bottoms of these peaks and trying to manage with smaller wavelengths so that we have and that's the idea of these more stable populations that can maintain.
That can be used in a beneficial manner for something because they're predictable.
Right. Used in a beneficial manner for let's be honest, us. I mean, that's what the whole idea is about.
Yeah, and
I mean, we're really tangenting off of here what I really want to talk about, but this is kind of interesting stuff.
Yeah, let's talk about wolves now.
Okay,
because they're part of it.
They're absolutely
and
part
everything
of it.
we just talked about. I mean, we are part of the reason. I mean, we are our management choices or lack thereof is part of the reason that wolves disappeared from many landscapes where they were at, and they are certainly the reason that they're back.
Right. So let's talk about that.
Yep.
At the beginning, we said this is a controversial topic. Wolves are a controversial topic. It's not a new controversial topic. This isn't a new controversy. People are very polarized about their feelings about wolves, and this goes back. And we've talked about this before. I'm virtually certain we've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. This goes back to like colonial times.
Well, there's a reason they extirpated them in Europe.
Right. Right.
It's not because they liked them.
Right. And then Europeans moved here and settled here. And some of the first journal entries that you see from some of the early colonies in the 1600s are, boy, deer numbers are really struggling. I think if we killed these wolves,
we'd have more
deer to eat. And that was the food source at the time, right?
Yeah.
So you're seeing this conflict with our resource starting in the 1600s here and dating back farther than that in Europe. Wolves have been the source of controversy for hundreds of years. So we're not going to solve anything anytime soon, right? It's going to remain a controversial species. Let's just lay that out from the front.
Because they're impactful. And so maybe impactful is a better word when you're talking about colonists than controversial. It's a species that because of the spot that it sits on the food chain, which is
right up near the top,
really close to us,
right up
we
there
are
at the top.
competitors, right? Then logically we're going to care about it. It's going to be like,
So
I'm a Jazz fan and I hate the Lakers.
You're gonna have a good reason to start liking the Lakers pretty soon. It looks like we're real close to a super team, but let's not go there. Although the Jazz, I will say,
will ruin the NBA, but let's not talk about it.
I will say though, the Jazz have had a pretty good opening to free agency.
I'm gonna love it when he signs with Toronto,
and they have one of the deepest benches.
Okay, go ahead. Let's talk about wolves.
Yeah, we'll talk. We could turn this into a sports podcast too.
We could,
but we'll talk about wolves. So controversial, been an issue since the 1600s. But let's talk about what's happened since then here in the country. So fast forward, and here's one thing that's bothered me, and you maybe have seen the same thing. We've been around this for a long time, you and I have, right? This issue for a long time. And I've heard so many groups, organizations that criticize the states in particular, say the reason we had to list wolves as an endangered species in the first place is because of states. And
isn't that annoying?
It's super annoying. Now, I will say states bear some responsibility. But if you go back, Congress, the United States Congress in, 1817, passed a law for a wolf bounty program. Congress did in 1817. Right, so they had a wolf bounty program. States followed suit. I mean, Michigan, for example, 1838, the 9th law passed by the Michigan legislature was a wolf bounty program. Wisconsin followed suit. 1865, they
Let's
had
just
a wolf
note
bounty
something.
program.
This is in a country with limited resources. So for those of you that think that they just passed this law for fun, realize that the reason that elected officials were making these choices is because they thought they had a problem.
Right.
So that's just important to stick in the back of your head.
Right. And this isn't a. You're right. So we have states with bounty programs, the federal government with bounty programs, and we have this nationwide effort to remove wolves, to eradicate wolves, and it's largely a successful program.
Yeah. And why? Like, why would that exist? Why would people want to eliminate wolves?
Yeah. So, and you know it. You tee
Yeah,
it
of course
up, right?
I do.
I mean, one of the biggest reasons are conflict with agriculture and conflict with other wildlife that's viewed as a protein source for humans.
And I think primarily to me, it is that conflict of, conflict with agriculture, which we see even today. The reality is, and here's one of the challenges wherever you have these healthy populations of wolves, is where we talked about us managing species, right? I can give you a tag for an elk, and I'm pretty sure you're not going to shoot a mule deer. And I know you're not going to shoot a cow, like a moo cow. That's not always the case when you have these these charismatic megafauna that are large predators that eat meat. Sometimes they're just going to eat meat. They really don't care, and they don't have a tag. They're, if it's a moo cow, they're probably going to eat it.
Opportunistic carnivores, right?
Yes.
They're going to take the easiest, lowest hanging fruit from a food source standpoint. And when they walk into a flock of sheep, it's like a giant buffet.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It's like Vegas.
Yeah, right? Yeah, kind of.
It's delicious.
So we had this eradication campaign led by the federal government, led by states as well. Here's one thing that I think is fascinating. So Yellowstone National Park, established in 1872. We think of Yellowstone National Park as this bastion of wilderness, like this idealistic representation of what the West was, that it's this untouched, pure ecosystem filled with all of the major flora and fauna.
And tour buses.
On the major roads through it. But did you know, and you probably do, but did you know, Yellowstone National Park, through the U.S. Army, actually both the U.S. Army and then the Park Service, they killed wolves in the park. They had a program to kill wolves in the park. The very last wolf killed in Wyoming, well, at least in Yellowstone National Park, was killed it was around 1923, by a park ranger who took a bison carcass and laced it with cyanide or some type of poison. Mm-hmm. And that brought in a wolf. The wolf fed on that carcass and died. That was a park ranger doing that because they had a program. They wanted to remove wolves from the landscape.
Why would you do that?
At least in that park, it was because the thought was people were coming there to see the elk and the bison, and
they
wolves
weren't there.
were feeding on that prey source.
Yeah.
Right. So
again, it is this management thing, and it'd be nice if there's a pendulum, everybody, and it'd be nice if the pendulum didn't just swing to the left and to the right, but realize that that's what you got into.
Yeah. Actually, I take it back. I said 1923. It was actually 1926. Last official killing of wolves in 1926.
I hope we're going to get here. But as people kick the states in the teeth for not doing a good job of managing wolves, I want to talk about, who protected wolves before the federal government did under the ESA.
Before the ESA existed?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, there were virtually no wolves to protect. But if you're wanting to talk about specifically Minnesota,
I want to talk about Wisconsin in 1957. But let's go ahead.
Yeah, that'll be interesting because Wisconsin actually, that 1957 is the year that Wisconsin ended their bounty program. So there's going to be a correlation there I look forward to talking about when we get to that part of the country. So, let's just kind of wrap this up. Wolves were largely eradicated from most of the country, most of the lower 48 states. There were reports of occasional wolves passing through Montana, seen in parts of Idaho, seen in Wyoming, reports of one or two here or there. And there was an established remaining population in northern Minnesota. Right? But for the most part, and then we had these other subspecies of wolves.
Yeah, and then the reason for the Minnesota, right, is because of the contiguous nature with Canada.
Right. It became a
Yes.
source, population source, right? And it turns out when you get into Alberta and British Columbia, there in Western Canada, they actually had some eradication programs in agriculture areas down in the southern part of the provinces that created barriers to movement for quite some time. So why you'd see them there in Minnesota. So they're gone, right? By the 1920s, they're virtually gone except for this remnant population there in northern Minnesota. Fast forward, and we have we have a couple of iterations of the Endangered Species Act. Wolves started receiving federal protection, and we'll get to the state protection piece here in 1 second, but they started receiving federal protection in 1966 under a first iteration of the Endangered Species Act. It was the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And then in 69, there was another iteration of that act because the first act wasn't viewed as protective enough. They were on that list as well. And then the Endangered Species Act that we know today, not in its current form, but the act we know today, was passed in 1973, and wolves were put on that in 1974. I'm going to stop right there because you wanted to talk something about
No,
Wisconsin.
just to note it, and U.S. Department of Interior in testimony, the last administration, so we're not even talking about this current administration, was testifying in front of Congress, and that was one of the points that they brought up, is that protections for wolves included in 1957, protections by the state of Wisconsin prior to the existence of the Endangered Species Act. And that was, I don't have the details on that bill. I just know that whoever at Interior, the deputy in front of Congress, brought it up.
So you don't know what the protections
I don't have
were.
it.
So what I do know is at that time there really weren't any known wolves in Wisconsin. So I'm curious. I'd be curious as to
if you're in Wisconsin, you can tell us the details.
Yeah, what those protections were in that 1957.
And if you worked at Department of the Interior and wrote that testimony, you can blame you.
But one thing that they did do, I know, is, which seems like it's not a coincidence, if in 1957 they passed some kind of a law to create protection, one of the things they also did is they got rid of their bounty program that year. Which
makes perfect sense.
Seemed pretty unnecessary since they hadn't had wolves there for quite some time. But here's where we are. Wolves are listed in 1974, but they're not the way you'd think. There are 4 different listing rules listing 4 different, what they're calling at the time, subspecies of wolves. Right. And they had the Rocky Mountain population.
Northern Rockies.
But that's not what they called them.
They called them the Rocky Mountain.
It was a northern, well, it might have been a northern Rocky Mountains, but it was a subspecies.
Okay.
They have what we now know of as the Mexican gray wolf population, but at the time they were viewed as something different, right? So they were listed. There was this eastern wolf population.
There's still controversy related to this one.
There is, and we'll get to that for sure. And then there was a 4th population, which was a Texas gray wolf population that was presumed extinct, but it was still identified and listed. Learned a lot more in the interim. I mean, this was 1974, and here's something. I don't know how many people listen to this that are as wonky as you and I are sometimes on diving into Federal Register notices. But I will tell you this. I went back and pulled the Federal Register notice for at least for the listing for the Northern Rockies population in 1974. Mm-hmm. You want to guess how long? Well, first of all, no. You want to, I don't want
just
to,
go.
You know how long that was?
It was certainly not hundreds of pages.
It was 1 page.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Like the listing document was 1 page, and it listed 7 other species on the same page.
Yeah.
It gave no reasons for the listing. It was just we're adding these to the list.
I don't believe that is the right way to do it, by the way, but I will say that is entertaining.
that's an aside. I was just fascinated by it because today
let's just list a bunch of stuff because we think we should.
Right. I mean, that one page listed 7 other species in the U.S. and 13 international species.
Because in my gut, might as well.
And actually, it was just under a page. It wasn't even a full page in the Federal Register. But I digress on that. I just thought that was kind of an interesting side note. Fast forward to 1978. This rule is critically important for where we are today. And so 1978, Fish and Wildlife Service has more taxonomic information. They have a lot more information about gray wolves across the country to make a better determination about what's really a subspecies, what isn't, and they reclassify gray wolves in 1978. So there's a new rule reclassifying, and what they do there is they say we are going to list gray wolves everywhere that they are found, or not found, we're going to list gray wolves in the entirety of the lower 48 states.
Blanket listing.
As endangered. Mm-hmm. Now, they have since identified and carved out red wolves as a separate subspecies and Mexican gray wolves as a separate subspecies. Red wolves are in North Carolina, Mexican gray wolves, Arizona and New Mexico. We're not going to talk about those 2 today. I'm mentioning those 2 just so you know they're there, but we're talking about everything else.
Yes. It's safe to say that they were lumpers.
I don't even know what that means.
Lumpers and splitters, 2 kinds of people.
Go
ahead.
You lost me. Sorry, you lost me. Anyway, we're not going to talk about those 2. We're going to talk about what we know as Canis lupus, the gray wolves in the lower 48 states. So this reclassification occurred, and gray wolves were classified as endangered everywhere except Minnesota. In Minnesota, they were classified as threatened. So you had that's the rule. And I was digging through this old rule. Mm-hmm. So I went back and I read the 1978 rule. And this part just blew my mind. Because you and I know where we both worked. We've talked about this. Everybody else knows we used to work for the Wyoming governor's office, right? Get this. So this rule comes out in 1978 in March. Mm-hmm. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is seeking letters of support for this rule. And governors of these states, I'm just going to list some states here. Governors of these states sent either letters of support or letters that did not oppose this nationwide listing determination. Right? Arkansas, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, Maine, Michigan, Montana, New Mexico, New York, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, Wyoming. Right? These governors sent in letters saying that we either support this rule for a nationwide endangered listing or we don't oppose it at least. Right? I found that interesting. I also thought it was interesting the types of groups that submitted comments back then that actually supported this rule.
Go ahead.
Safari Club International sent in a letter supporting the endangered listing nationwide, but they didn't support any listing in Minnesota. So here was the crux of the dispute in that 78 designation.
I want to hear that, but then I'm going to come back to the point.
Yeah. So the crux of the issue in 1978 was vast majority of commenters supported an endangered listing nationwide. The place where there was an objection is how they treated Minnesota. So there were two schools of thought on Minnesota. One of them was they should be listed as endangered like everything else. Mm-hmm. The other one was, look, this population has been stable or increasing for more than a decade at the time, since the 60s, and is doing quite well and can support human-caused mortality and has supported human-caused mortality, and they should be excluded from any listing altogether. The Minnesota government sought that. The safari clubs sought that. There are a number of sportsmen's organizations that said, look, in Minnesota, they shouldn't be listed. And the reason I think this is interesting is, and I'm interested in your thought, but the reason I think this is interesting is I think the support for this nationwide rule was because there was a recognition that, sure, you can call them endangered, call them whatever you want. There aren't any there. Yeah. And how are they going to get there? Think about states at the time.
Affect you.
Yeah,
if it doesn't affect you, you're like,
so
doesn't affect me.
The one state that had concerns, the one state that protested this,
was the state living with
was
it.
the state that was living with
the
it.
The state was had
the conflicts, that was dealing with wolves on the ground.
You know what's interesting about Minnesota and how they've had to deal with it over time? The reason that this recent hearing was in Minnesota, you know why?
And we're going to talk about what recent hearing you're talking about in a second. But
ground zero of the impact of the recovered wolf population is there. Like, you want to know where they're eating the cows right now, where they're eating people's dogs? It is right there in Brainerd, Minnesota.
Sure.
That's ground zero. And so that's why Interior said, if we're going to have a public discussion about this, let's go to where people are actually affected by it, rather than just, having a hearing someplace where it's just a mythical beast that doesn't really exist and live with us.
Sure. And they've been dealing with it.
Well, and I would say this. I mean, here's the other thing that's really different. All these states and all these governors who wrote in letters, those were different times. The ESA at the time, remember, ESA, the Clean Water, conservatives were supporting these acts. Why? Because certain communities, environmental communities and others, hadn't figured out how to weaponize the act yet to try and push an agenda that had nothing to do with the purpose of the act. That has occurred. They've figured it out now. These acts, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, these NEPA, these things have now, they've cracked the code, and groups that want land management to occur a certain way or have a different agenda in terms of species management have figured out that it doesn't matter what the original intent of the act was in some cases. If the language is there that allows me to leverage the language for legal purpose that the people who wrote the act didn't intend, I'm going to do that anyway.
Sure.
Because I have a different agenda that doesn't necessarily line up with the agenda of the guys who wrote the bill.
Sure. And we're talking, the act was passed in 1973, and we're talking 1978. And we're just getting into in 1978, we get the first amendments to the Endangered Species, the first substantive amendments to the act that are in response to litigation, that are done to say, whoa, we didn't see that coming. That's not what we anticipated. We got to fix the act.
And This is a great cautionary tale for all legislation that people, remember. Legislation affects people later too. It's not just what your intent was the day that you felt good about it and you're like, oh, this is a great idea. The reality is these things have to work 10 years from now and 20 years from now. They have a track record.
Sure.
They continue. Anyway.
Well, and the one reason I mentioned before that Federal Register notice of 1 page for all of these species is exactly to your point. You hadn't had this veritable cornucopia of litigation that, you like that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
It's a smorgasbord.
Yeah. This veritable cornucopia of litigation that has morphed, that has created out of whole cloth, out of judicial cloth, what has to be in these notices, what the federal agency must consider when making their determinations. So you've gone from something that might be 1 page. I've talked about grizzly bears before. I think the grizzly bear listing rule was 5 pages long, and the delisting rule, when you took the rule itself, and of course that's been kicked back by the court still, and so we don't really have a delisting rule anymore, but the last delisting rule for grizzly bears, when you take that rule and all of the associated documents that were necessary to support that rule, we were in literally thousands of pages of documents to try and get something delisted, and it still gets kicked back on nuance.
Yeah, we have created a whole new avenues of law, and opportunities for young aspiring lawyers to go litigate these things that never get fixed anymore.
But think about also resource use of an agency. And how they use the resources that they're allocated by Congress.
Can you imagine how much money some of these federal agencies would have to actually do on the ground work if they weren't paying attorney's fees?
Not just attorney's fees. Just think about the staff time necessary to put together
Oh, yeah. A NEPA
hundreds
plan.
and hundreds of pages of documents to get, not even NEPA, I'm just talking on the species-specific delisting or listing. And
On any of these rules.
Hundreds of pages that go into this now,
Yes.
thousands of pages.
I mean, it is by definition, like when people get frustrated with red tape and bureaucracy, like this is what we've created.
If you audit the resources spent on that kind of paperwork, which is driven by litigation, and a lot of the litigants that are driving that tend to be on one side of the political spectrum, right? And they're driving. They're the same groups that are crying to Congress saying, we need the way the act works better is we need more money. Put more money into this, and it's going to work better.
And then
at
they
the same
sue.
time, they're suing and causing the agency have to spend way more money defending the lawsuits, but also responding to the outcome of the
Can you imagine if we just step back and said, "Hey, let's all truce. Let's just shake hands. We'll all take our checkbooks that we were about to spend on punching each other in the face in court, and for 5 years, we're going to put boots on the ground, and let's see what happened 5 years."
Wouldn't that be something?
It would be awesome.
That'd be something.
Yeah, it's like, and you know what else would be awesome? Unicorns.
Yeah. Yeah, that.
Riding
So the
unicorns.
same kind of prospect. I see where you're going. I don't know. Genetic modification is getting to the point where unicorns might be a more realistic possibility than this handshake you're talking about.
I agree.
This boots on the ground. So we have the 1978 rule. Right? That 1978 rule. There was another thing that. First of all, there's another thing that happened in 1978 that's really, really important. Congress amended the Endangered Species Act in 1978. So this rule came out for this nationwide listing in March. In November of that year, Congress amended the Endangered Species Act. And in that amendment, they created what is called a distinct population segment as part of the definition of what a species is. So before that, and a distinct population segment, for those that don't know, it's an area it's biologically defined, not necessarily, it's geographically and biologically defined, but not political boundary defined. It's an area where the species lives, but it doesn't have any interbreeding. It's discrete from other populations.
Would it be fair to call it the island?
That's a
where
good way to describe it.
The island within the ocean of everything else is the island where this certain population lives, where they interact with one another.
But it doesn't interact with any other islands of that population.
Yeah, it would have to have a canoe to do so, and wolves don't have canoes.
Right. So
that would be cool if they did, though.
The reason, and we'll get to the reason why that policy is important, and I would love to see a wolf paddle a canoe.
Me too.
But we'll get to the reason why that policy is important here in a second. But I needed to lay that out there because a lot of what's happened in the last 40 years has been a result of, with wolves, has been a result of those two actions, that 1978 rule, reclassification rule, and then the creation of this distinct population segment, the creation of a recognized distinct population segment as a listable entity under the Endangered Species Act, which happened just a few months later. So that rule goes into place, and one of the things that comes out of that rule is that the Fish and Wildlife Service creates a series of recovery zones. Like, here are the 3 places we think we need to recover wolves to have a recovered population. Right? So one of the places that they identify, the northern Rocky Mountains. So they draft recovery plans for Mexican gray wolves, which I told you we weren't going to talk about again, but it's worth mentioning. That 1978 rule, they did that. It was later that they reclassified Mexican gray wolves as a subspecies, created a distinct population segment for them. They're not part of this.
They got their own island.
So they have their own island, right?
Yep.
Which means that there were two recovery plans that were outgrowths for gray wolves, as we know them in the rest of the lower 48.
2 islands.
Really 2 islands,
yes.
Right? The northern Rockies population and the eastern United States population. Now, the northern Rockies population, let's talk about these separately. So maybe the first thing to do is talk about the northern Rockies population.
Go.
Northern Rockies population, they create They actually don't create a distinct population segment. They create the boundaries of what will become a distinct population segment. But because of the way this policy was drafted, you had a nationwide rule listing them around the country. So there was a question for the longest time about whether if you listed something nationwide, could you then go back and carve out a piece of that as a distinct population segment, manage that, recover that, and delist that.
It's a lawyer's dream.
Oh my gosh, it is. So that's kind of what happened in the Northern Rockies. So the Northern Rockies are think of them as here's the DPS boundary. All of Montana.
Distinct population
segment. All of Montana. All of Idaho. All of Wyoming. The eastern third of Oregon and Washington. And can you name the last piece?
No, I can't.
There is a sliver in the panhandle of Utah that's part of that DPS.
Does Utah have a panhandle?
I think it's kind of a panhandle.
Okay, go. Just keep talking.
I was going to say, here's an interesting side note. How many states have panhandles?
We don't have time for this.
We have all the time in the world. It's a podcast.
At least 2.
Pop quiz.
Okay, so Utah, panhandle of Utah.
Panhandle of Utah.
All those of you living in the panhandle of Utah, write in.
Do you know, they've never, well, you lived in Utah. They don't call it a panhandle?
Nothing about Utah looks like a panhandle or pan. I'm just going to be frank.
Is it like a toilet seat? It's like
That's fair.
Like the flipped up part of the toilet seat?
Yeah. So you're talking about the Bear Lake area.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. That's better. Yeah,
okay, so we'll call it. So Utah's shaped like a toilet. Now that we've settled that, that answers so many of my questions about Utah right there.
I'm really sorry, everyone who lives in Utah.
It just dawned on me. Just
get back to wolves.
Okay, so they were delisted just above the seat of the toilet of Utah.
And the tank.
Or that's part of the DPS. Just
tank.
part of the tank, yeah.
Yeah, the front of the tank.
Yep, the front of the tank was part of this DPS. All right, okay, so
Go ahead.
Yeah, I hope that turns into a meme.
I hope it doesn't. Keep going.
All right, so Utah. Well, anyway, that's the Northern Rockies population. The way to recover that population, and this went through years of legal wrangling, right? But this was where we wound up with reintroduced populations of wolves in Yellowstone and central Idaho. And those two reintroduced populations, along with natural migration from Canada into northern Idaho and into Montana and into eastern Washington, those pieces, those reintroductions took place in the mid-90s.
And led to a recovered population in that area.
Population.
In that island.
That
island has the right amount of wolves that we all agreed when we started. It's like, hey, we ought to have at least this many.
Way more than that.
Yeah.
Way more than the
so whenever we said, it would be great if we had X number of wolves on this island. We're like, great, we have 3X number of wolves on the island.
The original target was, I believe it was, for the Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, it was like 300 wolves.
Yeah.
That was identified as, that's going to be a recovered population. Wyoming has more than 300 wolves alone. There's something like 1,500 wolves now in that recovered population. So, and part of that is because we hit the recovery objectives 6 years after reintroduction.
Yeah.
And it took another 15 to get them delisted.
Yeah. Because different groups had it no longer became about the integrity of the original agreement and the original plan. It became, you know what? We have a different view of what we think recovery should mean and how many animals we want to see and where we want to see them. And we don't care what the original agreement is. We don't care about your original intent. We're going to expand it to what we want it to be now because we have a different goal than you had.
Right. So that population met the recovery objectives, but we wound up in, when I say we, that's just because of having been associated with Wyoming so long, 5 different lawsuits before Wyoming ultimately got their wolf population delisted. Montana and Idaho
Act of Congress.
Congress
Yeah.
took an act of Congress to delist them. And actually the act of Congress was to reinstate the delisting rule that a judge had overturned. And the judge overturned basically saying you can't delist in Montana and Idaho.
Was that a judge out of Montana that did that?
Yeah, I believe it was Judge Malloy.
What a giant surprise.
It was Judge Malloy. I might be wrong about that.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, shocked and surprised. And yeah. So Montana, for folks that don't know, from a legal nerd standpoint, is in the 9th Circuit. So is Idaho. Wyoming's in the 10th Circuit, which creates a complicating legal stuff that we're not going to get into on all the strategy about where people file lawsuits and why.
I will say that people have listened to this show and shows and another podcast we listened to. We've heard people say like, oh, don't tell me that judges think a certain way or that they no. That is people that don't believe that their venue shopping occurs and that people who sit on the bench can sometimes have opinions and leanings. You're crazy if you don't think that's the case.
I'm going to give you some insider baseball here.
Okay, right? I'm ready.
As somebody that's done wildlife litigation for years and years and years, and I've been on a couple different sides of issues. It doesn't matter who you are in these cases. It doesn't matter if you're representing the state, if you're representing an environmental group, a landowner group, a sportsman's group. You are actively, as that attorney, you are actively going out and reading opinions written by judges that would be in prospective jurisdictions for your case, and you are trying to find what is the most sympathetic judge to my cause. That is, by definition, forum shopping. Yeah. That absolutely happens. It's a strategic decision that everybody makes to say, what court can I go into and have the best chance at the outcome I'm trying to receive?
It's very Pollyannish to be like, oh, I'm going to believe that doesn't happen, and I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt that doesn't. Don't do that.
Absolutely happens.
We live in a real world, so get rid of the fairy tale.
Anyway, so that those wolves were delisted congressionally, and then Wyoming ultimately were delisted. And here's an interesting tidbit: of all of the lawsuits that have gone on surrounding wolves in the lower 48 states over all of these years, this includes the Western Great Lakes states, this includes Mexican gray wolves, everything you want to talk about. The federal government has prevailed one time. And it was
good for you.
And it was in the Wyoming wolf delisting litigation that was where the circuit court ultimately upheld the delisting of that Wyoming population in 2017. The first time ever that the federal government prevailed on a wolf delisting lawsuit where they are supposed to be entitled to the deference to a high level of deference by the court for their level of expertise as the expert agency. Right?
To be frank, it's as if there's something wrong with the act.
Right? Maybe we've talked about that before.
Yeah.
So that's that population. It's delisted. It is delisted. States are managing them. They're being hunted. There's active management going on in all 5 of those. Well, 6, except Utah doesn't have any wolves established in northern Utah. But the states that do, those 5, the Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, they have active management of wolves. They're under state control, and those populations are remaining stable or increasing throughout their range. Big time success story there.
Somebody's eating a wolf tenderloin.
Yeah. Move east. Mm-hmm. I'm going to try a wolf tenderloin. I want to try a wolf
tenderloin. All right. I'll get you one.
All right. Sweet.
It's a goal.
Awesome. So move east.
Okay.
Western Great Lakes states. Similar. So there was a recovery plan established for Western Great Lakes under that 1978 rule. And they weren't it wasn't called the Western Great Lakes at the time. I think it was called just the eastern United States. But the idea, there were 2 recovery objectives in that. And there's a reason why I'm doing all of this, getting to what's happening today, right? And I know it's a lot of background, but there's so much that's gone on with wolves over all these years. So the eastern recovery objectives were, under the recovery plan, were 1, maintain the Minnesota population.
Mission accomplished.
Mission check. And 2, It was to have one viable wolf population outside of Minnesota and Isle Royale, Michigan. That was it. And you know what they did?
They were successful.
Wolves all over Michigan and Wisconsin, right? And so those two recovery objectives were met. They were met for a long time. They've gone through a similar process trying to get them delisted. And ultimately, they continue to come up with roadblocks. The most recent roadblock there was they tried to create this DPS, this distinct population segment, for this population, and then delist it. The lower court said you cannot create a distinct population segment for a species that was listed range-wide, like this 1978 rule did.
So basically, the court's saying you got to delist it range-wide.
So the court was saying you have to delist it range-wide. They appealed that. The circuit court overturned that piece of the decision and said, no, you can delist, you can create a distinct population segment and delist that, but you have to take into account what impacts that delisting has on the historic range and remnant populations that are not part of that DPS. What does it mean for wolves outside of that DPS if you delist it? And so they reinstated the listing rule. Basically, it looks like it has since 1978. There's no DPS, there's no distinct population segment. They're listed there. And so what the federal government has done is they've said, you know what? We created these three recovery plans, but we're not talking about Mexican gray wolves. We created these other two for the eastern wolf population and for the northern Rockies population. We've successfully delisted the northern Rockies population. We have not here. There are large pieces of the country that are covered by this 1978 rule that never had wolves historically. And you know what we're going to do? We think we've recovered wolves, and we're going to delist them nationwide.
Yep.
And so the federal government has proposed that. They've proposed a nationwide delisting.
Just like they listed them nationwide.
Right.
We're saying we're done. We're
saying we've recovered these populations that we set out to recover, and we're going to delist them.
Yep.
And you went up and testified in Minnesota on this.
I did.
What was that like?
I have never seen more people with less facts and more stuffed wolves testifying than I did that day. It was bonkers. And I would tell you that here's the issue, is that people, it was very easy to see what I consider to be the flaw that we were talking about, was people, they want a different goal. They're not, the people that came and testified saying wolves should not be delisted. Those people were people that in general, like, they were, their goal was that wolves never be hunted, that they be everywhere, that they curl up next to the fireplace in your living room and have a hot cocoa with you, and that is different than the wildlife managers who were there testifying, than the people who were hunters who were there testifying, than the officials who create the laws in the different communities in Minnesota and elsewhere were there testifying about. It was just, you had a logical group that looked at the intent of the act and whether that intent was met, and then you had a group that just, they had a different thing that they wanted to see done. And they want the act to protect those wolves as long and as far as possible and everywhere that it can, and for perpetuity.
Yeah, so I agree there's a segment that wants to see that happen. There's a pretty big segment.
You asked for my take. And
No, I know.
When the bus loads showed up from, literally, people were bussed into this. So you had this agricultural community, and you had buses coming in from Minneapolis and elsewhere where they literally, paid for people to come and to do nothing but this. And that's, was curious.
Yeah. Well, that 1974.
Bust them in.
I know. So that 1974 rule.
You know how many buses I had to pass in my RT Challenger? on the way from the airport. A lot of buses.
Of everybody that wanted holding their pet wolves or their stuffed animal.
It was
wolves.
a stuffed animal.
Yeah, stuffed animal.
As I blew past them, going slightly faster than the speed limit.
Sure. Well, you had to get to the front of the line.
Well, you know, the rental car gods were good to me that weekend.
You know that 1974 rule, and other like right to this point, you're talking about the types of folks coming in there. The 1974 rule, the total number of comments received on this nationwide listing rule, or maybe it was the 78 rule, whatever it was. Anyway, like under 2,000. That's counting the form letters and the number of people that signed on to form letters. It came up to under 2,000. Right now, I checked today, we're looking at July 3rd. And the public comment period on this rule is open. I think it closes, you said, July 15th.
Yes.
Right? On July 3rd. And you get a huge flood at the end of this. There'll be a huge slug of comments that come in. But as of today, July 3rd, in the afternoon, there are 95,060 comments posted on the Federal Register in response to this. And that's not even counting all of the petitions that are out there and all the signatures gathered on petitions that are going to be submitted.
Did I tell you Don Pay was at the hearing?
No, you didn't.
That's very entertaining. We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
But shout out to Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, backcountry hunters and anglers, both of which were there testifying that, you know, this delisting was the appropriate thing to do. I mean, sportsmen's groups like that, you know, taking that stand, saying states can manage populations. And that's really, to me, that's kind of what, you know, I went to talk about is like, you know, I went to talk about Pittman Robertson. I wanted to talk about, you know, these industries that fund conservation, and then to just say, look, states have done a great job of managing wildlife populations and recovering them. They can be trusted with these wildlife populations. And that was the contrast to those other groups. It's like, oh, you can't trust states with wolves because they're going to be gone again. Well, how laughable is that?
Well, you know, the one thing I always tell those people, and they have no response for this, and it applies to wolves and everything else. Of every species that's ever been delisted, and that's not a lot, right? But of every species, it's dozens.
Yeah.
You know, but of every species that's ever been delisted, none of them have been relisted.
Once they've gone into state control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
the states, you know,
and that's what they don't get. Like, states have been doing this a long time. They're good at it. They have the resources and they're motivated.
Right. And you can't use history from 150 years ago as a guide.
Yeah, when there was no management agency, law, or regulation.
Right. Or even in the early stages of having the management agency, there were nationwide policy decisions made at the time that said, look, we don't want wolves on the landscape.
Yeah,
states were just as guilty as the federal government, as everybody else is saying, you know what, we don't want them here. We're going to have bounty programs to get rid of them, right? We have learned a lot since the early 1900s, the late 1800s, when these programs were in existence. And it's asinine to stand up there and say the states can't do it because they're the reasons that we don't have they're the reason we don't have them in the first place.
Well, and I love that. And again, you know who else was on the table? Like hunters. Like, oh, hunters are the bad guy. I'm like, really? You know, you're talking about, you know, hunters in certain industries, and I'm like, who is paying for wildlife conservation in this country? It is not people with stuffed wolves under their arms coming from Minneapolis that are paying for wildlife conservation.
And you know how you get support for having wolves on the landscape? I mean, one of the things that we both know is it's a challenging issue.
It is.
To get support on the landscape for wolves, especially when they're a listed species, because there's so little that you can do to combat the conflict that occurs. Wyoming was in a special situation where there was a lot of tension. We had an experimental population reintroduced. As part of that experimental population, it allowed for some management of conflict that you could remove, working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, remove some of these animals that were taking livestock. But some places didn't have that. And under the Act, you couldn't resolve some of those conflict situations. How do you do that? You have a managed population, managed by the state, that has where you have you're going to have human caused mortality. You're going to have wolves that are trapped or hunted or whatever. But by having that and having sustainable wolf populations, but having a managed wolf population with allowable mortality, you're going to have folks say, okay, I'm still not a fan of wolves. I still don't like them, but I can live with them. Right?
That's what
Whereas
happens
before it was, I don't like them and I can't live with them. So I'm just going to shoot. I'm going to shovel. I'm going to shut up.
Yeah. I mean, that's what people, there's not an appreciation of that one of the biggest disincentives to the ESA working correctly is what people feel like is a punitive nature of it, like the inability to live with it, and that's, I would call it a falsity that unfortunately is reinforced by what they're seeing out there. Because when when all you know of the ESA is endless litigation, inability to delist, it goes right to the heart of the integrity of the act, which is that, this assumption that if we find a listed species, we're going to work hard to recover it. And when we do, we're going to be able to live with it. When you don't see that in application at the end of the day, when all you see is when we recover it, it doesn't matter. It's still going to, rule your life. It's going to suck resources. When you don't, it's a real disincentive to the people who live with those species every day for them to coexist and to help those species thrive.
I agree. And that leads me to one more point on this nationwide delisting rule. So one of the arguments on the flip side of this, you have the segment that you talked about that you saw standing up there, bust in, that just don't want to see them hunted, don't want to see, right? So they have a different reason for not wanting to see delisting. There's another camp that doesn't want to see delisting in certain places because their argument is, look, we believe they've recovered in some places, but just not everywhere they need to recover yet.
Yep.
We think there are places in the Pacific Northwest or in the Northeast where
we think if we put enough wolves on this island, that some of them will cut canoes and paddle to a new island.
Well, that's actually what happened. So here's a little bit of a nuance. This is a real challenge with this delisting rule, right? Nationwide rule. If you take the logic of, let's use the Pacific Northwest as an example. Right? If the idea in the Pacific Northwest, if one of the arguments is that we need to allow more time for that population to completely recover into places in Washington and Oregon and Northern California. There are wolves in all of those places, but have they recovered enough to warrant delisting, losing federal protection? Right? One of the problems is there's no mechanism. Absent a nationwide delisting right now, there's no mechanism to actually delist those wolves. So if you're going to make that argument, you have to come up with an alternative to a nationwide. Somehow you have to have a nationwide delisting. So if you're going to ask for recovery there, you effectively have to have recovery everywhere.
Everywhere that potentially they could be
before
there was
you can
habitat.
Get this population that even if there were agreement that it warrants recovery and should recover more, it's going to get there fast. There are already wolf packs there, right? But you won't be able to delist them because one of the things that you have to be able to now, because of this nationwide delisting rule of 1978, you have to be able to establish this distinct population segment and delist it. Well, those populations were formed by movement from Idaho, right? And Montana, from these populations that are part of a distinct population segment that was delisted. So they don't have the discreteness necessary to qualify as a distinct population segment.
They're recognized because of the island they came from, not because
they're part of that same island.
Yes.
Only the boundary isn't defined to include them. So you could potentially,
This is very confusing and wonky.
It is, so, and I'm going to leave it right there. But I'm just saying, the other piece of this. So, like I was mentioning, there's a camp out there that says they're just pieces of this population that haven't recovered yet, and we need to let them recover. My argument and another one that's identified is in Colorado. My argument to that would be this, and maybe this is where I sit personally. I don't know for sure. Maybe I shouldn't even. I'm just going to say
some people think this.
yes, right. those states, in particular Oregon and Washington, they have wolf recovery plans in place. They actually have state Endangered Species Acts. In Washington, they're still listed under their State Endangered Species Act. In Oregon, I think if they haven't been delisted, they've been proposed for delisting under that act. But they have wolf recovery plans. And there's a political environment there, at least west of the Cascades, where the vast majority of the people are, that really supports having wolves there. It's a prime example of a place where you could delist and wolves are going to be fine because the states are going to manage to have wolves there. Same thing goes for Northern California. And I'd say the same thing for Colorado. Here's the thing about Colorado. And this one, I don't know if it blows your mind the way it blows my mind, but typically, wolf reintroduction, wolf expansion, wolf recovery, that's all been driven by the science up to this point. Yeah, there have been some politics involved. Congress got involved and delisted the Montana and Idaho populations, but they delisted or reinstated the delisting rule that supported, they're basically saying, we support what the scientists said.
Yes.
It's delisted, they've recovered. Yeah. They should be delisted. Colorado's approaching something a little bit different. They're in the process of some citizens are pursuing a ballot initiative, getting the signatures to get wolf reintroduction on the ballot. They have to do that because there's a law in Colorado on the books that says you can't reintroduce a threatened or endangered species into this state without approval of the legislature, and the legislature won't approve wolf reintroduction. So now citizens are going a different route and pursuing a ballot initiative to get wolves reintroduced in Colorado.
It's fair to talk about one aspect of this. When you're talking about citizens putting this on the ballot, know that this is Ted Turner money coming in and paying for the efforts that paid for the effort in the legislature and is paying for the ballot initiative. So people that think that this is just, a few random people in Colorado who just decided to do this, know that there are outside interests that are pushing this issue on the people of Colorado. And of course, that dives to, again, the ideological nature of it and how some people are choosing to do this.
Right. And one of my points about this is when we're talking about this nationwide delisting rule, this proposed delisting rule, and some of the arguments are focused on Colorado and how there's a need to have recovery there. Well, if you step back and really think about it, about how this works, if you wanted to use the Endangered Species Act to reintroduce wolves in Colorado, the process to do that is potentially decades long. Right? So you'd go through getting your state approvals, you'd go and petition the federal government. You'd have to go through and have a NEPA done, wherever you want to have these wolves. There's going to be litigation over that, and NEPA being the National Environmental Policy Act. You're going to have to do an environmental analysis for a reintroduction. What's the impact on the human environment going to be? There's going to be litigation that results from that analysis. And then you might get to the point where there's actually wolves put on the ground. After it's this long, long process. You're going to have to designate an experimental population. What's the area that you can put these wolves? All of that stuff is going to have to be done in conjunction with the federal government and subject to the Administrative Procedure Act and lots of litigation and so forth, right? And it worked. It happened. It happened in Idaho and Wyoming. It can happen. That was a long, long process. If you delist wolves nationwide and wolves are no longer on the list in Colorado, it becomes a lot easier for Colorado to reintroduce wolves if they want to.
Yeah.
It's under state management. They can make a state decision. They'll still have to be, because it would be on federal land, they'd still have to go through this
consultation.
NEPA. Well, they'd have to go through the NEPA, right? Yeah. And there might be litigation over that. But they can get there a lot faster. But what you have, so they could do that. My concern with the process they've got in Colorado right now is you have, for the first time I can see, you have, rather than the biologists making the recommendations to the politicians, you have the citizens potentially putting mandates on the biologists, and telling the Fish and Game Commission in Colorado, here's what you have to do. We don't care what the biology says. We don't care what it means for impacting other species of wildlife.
Wildlife management by mob rule.
Wildlife management by suburban America, right? Because where are they going to pick up? They have to pick up 124,632 signatures by December 13th. Where are those going to come from?
It will not be in the small towns where people are living with the results.
It's going to be downtown Denver and suburban America, right? That's where the signatures are going to come from.
Oh, fascinating.
There's so much going on, around wolves. We haven't even touched on Isle Royale and the situation going on up there. We may have to in the next few weeks do a follow-up podcast.
We're just going to we're just not going to talk about anything but wolves anymore.
That's all we're going to talk about ever.
This is the wolf podcast.
All wolves all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's your mountain, and we're going to change it. Instead of an elk bugling, it's just going to be wolves howling.
And elks, and it'll be elk running. And
instead of us running.
Suffering.
Yeah. Rabbit screams.
So, just a reminder to folks out there, like I said, we'll do another podcast at some point in the future because there's still a lot of wolf history and wolf politics going on that we haven't talked about. But this proposed nationwide delisting rule that's out there, if you want to comment on it, you still have a little bit of time. Get your comments in, go to the Federal Register. I can even give you the Federal Register notice number, I think.
Google it.
Here.
Just Google it. Just Google it.
You can
just sure. Google it, people. You can find it on Google faster than you're going to get that easier than trying to write down what Dave's about to say. Just Google.
I was going to give you the docket number if you want it. The docket number is FWS-HQ-ES- 2018-0097.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
You're welcome.
Very helpful.
Yeah. So go out there if you want to submit a comment, get that comment in by July 15th, whether you oppose or support it. If you want to weigh in,
I got to tell you the one thing about that I was sorry that I did not have with me when I had several copies of my notes. What I was going to talk about the testimony. I have a dog that loves to eat stuffies. Like stuffed animals. Man, I wanted my dog. I was like, gosh, the dog would have
town on these wolves.
It would have been a stuffed animal disaster, but it would have been very entertaining to watch.
So let's leave it at this. Wolf recovery in the lower 48 has been, I think it's safe to say it's been a conservation success story. We never mention the fact that there are tens of thousands of wolves around the globe.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands.
So, when we're talking about wolves having been imperiled or eradicated from the United States at the lower 48, we failed to mention that this is not a species in jeopardy of going extinct globally.
Yes,
there are tons of wolves around, right, all over the globe.
Well,
they live in Israel, for crying out loud. They live in Iran, in Russia, all over Europe. I mean, they're just...
What we're talking about is a management decision.
Right.
When you come back to it, this is that decision of it's not whether or not they're going to... It's what we want it to... It's what we would like our world to look like.
And what is the social acceptability for wolves on the landscape in the lower 48 states, and where and at what numbers? And that's what we're talking about here. Because we're not talking about losing a population globally, having a species blink out entirely and nobody's ever going to see a wolf again, right?
No. We're talking about how much money we're going to throw at this species that isn't in trouble instead of putting that money towards species that will wink out.
We've got a lot of issues around salmon, for example, right? A lot of issues there. A lot of other species that are on the cusp. Black-footed ferrets that need help. Wolves are a good conservation success story, but as you know from the history of hundreds and hundreds of years of controversy around them, there will continue to be multiple camps in this wolf debate about how many there should be, where they should be, and whether we should hunt them or not. And it's a story as old as time. Isn't that a Disney song? No? A Whole New World, whatever.
Oh. I'll tell you what, I gotta go.
Yeah, I know you do. So, but that's what I wanted to leave us there with remembering this is going to continue to be a hot topic, and we're going to continue to touch on it. Nephi's going to go out and shoot a wolf and give me the tenderloins.
And it's going to be delicious.
And it's going to be delicious. We'll have a big backyard barbecue.
That's not a promise, everyone. It's just like, it's a hope.
It's something that
for the
might
future.
happen.
It's a dream.
Yeah, maybe it'll happen. And we will do a future podcast on wolves to cover more of because there's just so much going on around wolves. I think we need to do another one. But until then, Nephi, enjoy your 4th of July holiday.
You too, Dave.
I'm going to do that. You have a good time. Say hi to the family for me.
Yeah.
And for everybody else out there, I hope you do the same. And remember that life is about experiences. So go have one.
God bless America.